Good morning, everyone. A very special warm welcome on behalf of Whangarei Seventh-day Adventist Church. We welcome the entire Kershaw family, Greta, the kids, grandkids, extended family, friends. Thank you for those who travelled both near and far to be here today, to pay respect, but also to give memory to George Kershaw, a splendid man, even better husband, and a servant of God as well. And so we really do appreciate your support in coming through for today. And we welcome everyone here as well as viewers who are tuning in online, wherever you might be tuning in from. Just a couple of announcements before we get on with today's service. The bathrooms are, if you go straight out the church to your left, just down the hallway, both men and female, male and female, down the passage to your left. We encourage you, if you haven't done so already, please to put your phones on silent. We wouldn't want work calls to be coming through halfway through this morning. And then just a reminder that we do have light snacks available after the service in the hall, and the hall's located all the way down the passage, and you walk straight into the venue. So that'll be straight after the service. Then lastly, we have a memorial signing book on behalf of the family, which is outside the church itself in the foyer. And if you haven't already done so, we encourage you to please sign that book on your way out, or we will actually bring it into the hall a bit later and you can sign it there. As we start today's service, I encourage us all to just stand as we sing our opening hymn, What a Friend We Have in Jesus. Let's stand together. Apologize for those technical difficulties. While we're all standing, let's just bow our heads for a word of prayer. Dear God, we come here gathered this morning, and we are thankful for the opportunity to be here. It is obviously a day filled with sorrow and sadness for the loss of such a beautiful man, but we are also privileged that we can be here to support one another as family and also pay respect to George Kershaw, all the loving memories that we could share over so many years. And so this morning we gather today to pay respect and thank you for the time we could share with George. And pray that you'd be with us for the rest of today's service. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you. You may be seated. At this moment, we're going to have a few tributes by the family. And after those tributes, we'll have an open tribute session, starting off with some of the kids. And if you would like to share a few words about George or to the family, can I encourage you maybe just to make your way to the front rows so we can just keep it flowing. So when we do get to the open tribute section, just make your way to the front, either side of the church, and then you can come up and share a few words. All right, thank you. We invite Gary to come to the front. Thanks, Gary.
Good morning, everybody. As I've been introduced, my name's Gary, and I'm Greta's nephew, for those of you that don't know. And I've had the family ask that if I would do the honours and read George's life sketch. I would just suggest to you that there's 88 years to cover here, so make yourselves comfortable because there's a lot to cover off. Most people called him George, but his name was George Edward Hunter Kershaw, and he was born on the 28th of October 1935 to proud parents of Jim and Daphne Kershaw. You probably think that's a pretty distinguished name, Hunter. Well, apparently that came from his mother, whose maiden name was Hunter, so they slipped that in on George's name. In 1945, George became the older brother to his sister, his new sister, that was, Anne. Remember those days, Anne? George started his education at Lower Hutt in 1940, and his education was then completed at Longbourn College, the Adventist boarding school, in 1953. He stayed on at Longbourn, where he completed his building apprenticeship. And this proved to be very, very beneficial throughout George's working life, as you will hear in stories to come. Talking about stories, there were many stories that could have been told of the hijinks he got up to at Longbourn during his stay there. As time goes on, many of the instigators of these stories have also passed, but you can be assured that George was never one to hold back when hearing some of the stories. To this day, if the family ever mentions the surname Kershaw within church circles, the response is usually, "Oh, are you any relation of George's?" And that has happened many times over the years. Once George completed his apprenticeship and his time at Longbourn, George then moved to Auckland and took a completely different career path. He started working for Sanitarium Health Food in the wholesale sale division in Upper Queen Street in Auckland, and then later accepted a role to drive the sanitarium trucks for deliveries up through the northern region. Again, apparently the stories, there were many to be told of his escapades driving trucks. Today would get you into trouble because there were deadlines to meet, and there was little time sometimes, and there was much hair-raising driving, so I've been told. In 1958, George met the love of his life, Greta, and after a few ups and downs, they were married in October in 1961. They purchased their first house and lived in Te Aratu North, as it was called in those days, in Auckland. And while there, they had their first child, Julie, in 1964. A few years later, another girl, Denise, was born in 1966. With a new house and a young family to support, George decided to take on some extra work, and he took on driving taxis around Auckland. Again, by all accounts, he had plenty of stories to tell. From the people he picked up to some of the happenings that the passengers got up to, some of these were just not repeatable today. But often Greta was waiting for him and wanted to know what had happened throughout his shift when he arrived home. Nothing has changed much, Greta. Apparently, you just love catching up on what's on the action. Initially, George thought he knew the streets of Auckland pretty well. But as time went on, and with the additions of new motorways and being constructed, he felt another career change looming. in 1966, TV had just arrived in New Zealand, and at that time, one of the hit programs was a program called Green Acres. If you can remember that, you're old. This must have inspired George and Greta, and as they decided it was time for them to own their own green acres. So they packed up the family, the young family, and did what anyone would do. They went farming. Of all the places that they could move to, they chose the furthest place away from Auckland and civilization you could imagine, a little remote place called Waiotoumarama in the Hokianga. For those of you that aren't sure where that is, if you think of Opanoni, it's just a little bit south of that. Not only was it a very pretty remote location, but the 100-year-old house they moved into hadn't been very well maintained and was a bit ramshackle with no modern facilities, and the little room was outside. It was a pretty tough start for a mum with a young family, but they were now farmers. It was December 1969 when George had the biggest smile on his face. After being surrounded by females, finally a boy was born. Stephen had arrived. In anticipation of another child and plenty of ribbing from Greta, George had started to build a new house on the property. And apparently the doctor would not let Greta home with the new baby until at least one door was installed in the house. So the pressure went on George to make it livable. Very typical of a builder's house, it still wasn't finished 13 years later when they moved out. During this time in the Hokianga, word got around through the valley that this practical guy had moved into the area, and soon George was being asked to take on all sorts of agricultural building projects. From building of cow sheds to bridges, you name it, George would have a go at it. In those early days, he also taught woodwork at the local school. Yes, that building apprenticeship was playing its part and paying dividends. Just last year, apparently one of the kids ended up talking to one of the locals when they were visiting the area, and as it transpired, he had been a student of George's way back in the day. So he obviously had had a positive influence on the kids in the area. George worked extremely hard and made dramatic improvements on the farm, including the building of a new milking shed and the rebuilding of stock pens. The rundown farm that he had originally purchased had been transformed. He ended up running both sheep and dairy, and so he and Greta were always kept very busy. One story that has been told apparently many times was when George rolled the tractor and nowhere near any help in the middle of the boonies. On this day, he'd been cultivating a hillside paddock up the road away from the farmhouse. And as the story goes, he had successfully negotiated this hill a couple of times and thought he would do it a third. Well, as the saying goes, third time lucky. But maybe in this case, it was unlucky. Going up the hill for the third time, the steel wheel caught and tipped the tractor over a number of times. George reportedly said that it was at least 5 or 6 times, but we're not quite sure if the story was exaggerated. But by all accounts, he was a very lucky man. He arrived home after riding the motorbike back and said to Greta, who greeted him at the doorstep, "I rolled the tractor." Not only had he torn his right knee open, but he had been covered in battery acid that had eaten away his shirt. Needless to say, he was laid up in a cast for a number of weeks. In 1975, there was another big surprise. 1974, there was another big surprise. Nigel, a clone of George, arrived. There was no doubt that Nigel had inherited the good looks of his father. The girls eventually decided it was time to leave home, and they came to live in Whangarei. And soon after, George and Greta decided to sell their farm in Waiatamarama and move somewhere a little bit more accessible and purchase the property in Parua Bay in Whangarei. While having a smaller property, which just ran dry stock, it left time for idle hands. George needed to keep himself busy. So his career path took yet another turn. With the gift of the gab, he worked as a product rep for Sally's, covering the upper northern districts. And then he decided to try another career, and then he went selling real estate. His area of specialty was farms and land, and this took him all over Whangarei from east to west and further up north. There was another thing that played a big part in George's life, and that was boats. He had had several runabouts in the Hokianga when he was there, and when time would allow, he would love getting out on the harbour or heading down the coast for a fish. It seems that this passion has also rubbed off on Nigel. Somehow motorboats then turned into sailing boats, and George purchased 2 hull and deck fiberglass yachts and outfitted them, both in the backyard of their house in Parua Bay. One of these would eventually be sailed up to the Pacific Islands. Greta and George lived on the yacht for the sailing seasons for 3 years from 1992. And in this time, they sailed to Tonga, Fiji, New Caledonia, Vanuatu, and the Solomon Islands. Eric Hanna was also their experienced crew member to guide them to the islands, as George had never been that far offshore before. Unlike a lot of cruising wives, Greta also made the voyage from New Zealand. A lot of the wives let their husbands take the boats up to the islands and then flew up to meet them once they had arrived. But Greta, never to miss out on an adventure, she always sailed with George. They also toured down through the east coast of Australia from Brisbane up to Cairns and back again, and other family members took advantage of the experience and had a great time exploring the Australian coastline. For those of you that are interested, the name of all the yachts were called Giota. Greta had spent hours along with some opposition, possibly a bit of arguing from George trying to come up with a suitable name for the boat. Greta tried all sorts of name combinations, and then just one day she just found that perfect name, Giota. It was the simple combination of both George and Greta's name and how suitable that was. All good things must come to an end, and George and Greta, along with their trusted blue water crew, Nigel, brought the boat back to New Zealand in 1994. From there, a chapter in their lives began, and they found a property in Fisher Terrace in Carmo, where they lived for 20 years. While living there, George took on yet another project on his front lawn. The neighbours can't have been too impressed pulling back the curtains that one morning when they saw the crane hoisting a 44-foot boat above the road and onto George and Greta's front lawn. This time around, it was a complete refit of the insides. So on that day one, George, Greta and the boys were there with hammers pulling things apart. Like other projects, not always completed, this boat was launched unfinished with a few things still to complete as well. But that was George. As time went on, George lost a bit of interest in the adventure of sailing, and the last of his boats was sold. While he still had a passing interest in boats, he had no real desire to push himself and sail again. Having given the ocean away, there was a much bigger challenge looming onshore, which ended up keeping George and Greta busy for a number of years. Nigel had purchased some land with the prospect of building a house. The problem was It looked like it was straight off the slopes of Mount Everest, steep and full of rocks. Greta and George, now in their late 60s, couldn't resist the challenge of helping Nigel to build this house, and this took several years to complete. Nigel was full-time work, and while George and Greta were meant to be retired, the going got tough, but there was no option. The house had to get finished. And as it turned out, they did finish it, and it was a complete credit to George and his tenacity. Now, with both George and Greta still recovering from the project and starting to feel some age-related pain starting to kick in, the choice was made to downsize and move again into a more suitable, smaller house and property. And as always, George has had the strict criteria about what he wanted. It must be a standalone house, no shared driveway, and he must have room for his trusty 58-year-old trailer. They found the suitable unit, that unit that met all the criteria in Clark Road in Carmo, where they've been for the last 8 or 9 years. George had started to slow down, and the last couple of years has proved a bit of a tough time for George and the family. George unfortunately had had a series of strokes which became quite debilitating. After each time of being in hospital, George was determined to recover and carry out his rehabilitation at home. This may have been an ideal scenario, but even with some community assistance, it just proved too much for Greta as a full-time carer. The decision was made to find a full-time caring facility to cater for George's increasing health requirements, and he was transferred directly there from hospital in November of last year. As you have heard this morning, George was a very practical guy who could turn his hand to anything, and he had lived an accomplished and adventurous life. So as I close this snapshot of George's life, Greta, Julie and Wayne, Stephen and Nigel, Denise, would like to take this opportunity to thank you all firstly for being here today and your support throughout the years, especially during the last week, which has really been appreciated. Thank you. I'd just like to invite Dennis up now to say a few words. Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you, Gary. I'm Dennis, as you've heard, and I'm married to George's sister, Anne. When George was a young fella, we were talking in the house a couple of days ago, and there were a few stories and things that we'd come up with that's that wasn't in our speeches. So here's a few little scenarios. When George was a young fella, he rolled the Series E, and I think you might have seen it up there on the screen, and it caught fire. Now, there's 10 years age difference between George and Anne, and what she remembers in their home in Ipuni Street in Lower Hutt was that George came home and spread out all the leftovers from the car that he managed to salvage before it burnt to the ground. One Christmas holiday, George takes his family to the South Island, and he called into our place on the way down. We lived in Hamilton, and he wasn't going in his HQ Holden and caravan. No, he chose to go in their Morris 1100. It was a lot smaller, cheaper on fuel, didn't cost so much to get across on the boat, and so that was the choice. And so they had 4 kids and 2 adults. And wow, how do you get 6 people into a Morris 1100? We've heard of people getting 20 people into a Mini, but that's just the Mini's not driving anywhere. And so poor Nigel was the youngest. He took the short straw, and he had to sit on the handbrake. George made a roof rack to take all the gear. The car looked like it had been lowered. It was so down on the suspension. That was a nice and cosy holiday. Of course, the upside of that is they got to stay in motels. So that was the good side of it. And you've just heard that George worked for the sanitarium, and he was a taxi driver for a short while. What he didn't like about being a taxi driver were the boozy customers. He hated the boozy customers coming. He also got a fright when one of the customers slid across the seat and put her hand on his knee. He got such a fright, he got the fright of his life, and he couldn't get rid of her quick enough. Probably about the second time. The first time I met George was when we were married, and the second time was on his farm in Waimamaku. He bought a farm for $50 an acre. Now, isn't that fantastic? If the farms were that cheap, if land was that cheap, $50 an acre. And the family wanted us to move up there. And I don't know how my boys would have liked that, but they might have liked it. But I said I'm a mechanic, and the only time I'd be happy is if the tractor broke down. When we visited up there, he took us fishing, and I remember going out once, and I caught a shark. It was great excitement pulling in the shark. And when we cut it open, it had a whole lot of babies inside it. And once we were up there, he took me. We were a few of the. I don't know whether we all were there, but we skied across. I had the privilege of skiing across the Hokianga Harbour. That was really quite good. And then another holiday we had with George and Greta and family, we went to Cooper's Beach, and we went fishing one day and came back with a load of fish, and we left our rods underneath the caravan, as you do, but there was a cat around, and the cat got caught on one of the baits, on one of the hooks, and so we had a bit of a problem getting I was holding the cat's head, and George was trying to feed the hook back, you know. It's a bit hard to get the hook out, you know. And so we tried for a while, and so I held the cat's head really tight, and George got some pliers and ripped it out of the cat's gum. And the ladies had a saucer of milk there, and you can't believe it. The cat went and lapped up the milk as if nothing had happened. It was just amazing. It just like it wasn't there. So it was just amazing. So from there, from Gorge Road where they used to live, they moved to Parua Bay, and as you've heard, once again another farm. And I remember one day when we were there was a cow having a calf, and the calf wasn't cooperating. It wasn't coming out, you know, and George had tried. He thought about the tractor and pulling it out with a tractor, and so what he did, he had to work out how much it was going to cost to get a vet out on a Sunday to sort things out, or was it easier just to shoot the cow? And so I'm not actually sure, because that afternoon we came back home, so I didn't actually hear the results of that. A few years ago, some of our friends from Hamilton, being Colin Amos and Bruce Pitchford, decided to hire a yacht and sail out of Auckland and sail around the islands that are in the Waitemata Harbour. So I gave George a ring and suggested that we should go with him as well in his yacht. So up we came with my seasick pills, and we packed up George's yacht with provisions, and we set sail for Whangarei to Auckland, and we met up with our friends. One thing that I was a bit disappointed about Greta, you probably know, that George was not very interested in going fast. I wanted to see the sail up. There were boats catching up to us, and there were boats in front of us, and I wanted to pass them. But George kept the motor. He motored most of the way down. It was just amazing. Well, you got sails free, but he wasn't too worried about that. He was just motoring. So anyway, we did have a good time with our friends at that time. Now, George was very good at everything he laid his hand on. He was a good farmer, a good builder, an engineer, and he was a chairman of the church school up here too for a long time. And there's even the library he built called the George Kershaw Library. He built that, you know. So there, he's very, very smart man. He came down to our house in Hamilton, and my boys and I don't know whether Gavin did that much, but Murray and I basically dug out our basement, and George came along, and we put the RSJs in underneath the house, and George built our basement to the engineer's drawings. George has built several houses, as you've heard also, and at least 5 boats. You buy the hulls and then put all the insides in them and that. He's pretty smart at that, very good. And George and Greta have been good friends to us over the years, and we will miss you, George, and until we meet again. Thank you. Oh, Cherie, would you like to come up now?
I'm Cherie Liggett, representing the Whangarei Adventist Christian School. I have known George since childhood. Our parents were friends, and my first memory of George is when he was a 5-year-old, when I was 5 and he would have been about 12. And I remember he had red hair, he was a prankster and an absolute tease. Our paths crossed several times in the intervening years, but more recently I had the privilege of working George through the school. When George returned from his overseas sailing venture, and I don't know when was that, about the mid-90s, he became a member again of the school board. We both shared a passion for the school, for students, and for Christian education. The school received a bequest from the Sheffield family in the late 90s, so the Board of Trustees at the time decided to build a 3rd classroom. George worked with another builder, Michael Pram, and completed the classroom. Of course, there was always any building projects at school. There were board members, partners of spouses on the board or whatever, always a group thing, but George was usually the chief builder. Approximately 3 years later, after that, as I remember, after the 3rd classroom, George became board chair. So being chair necessitated more commitment and responsibility, including when the alarm went off in the middle of the night, George would be called out, and he would have to go investigate what had gone wrong at school. And Greta wouldn't let him go on his own, so it always went along too. So wherever George was working, Greta was there hovering. We appreciate that, Greta. But usually what caused the alarm to go was a spider making a home in one of the sensors. So nothing terribly exciting. And that often wasn't discovered till the next day. The building of the library, and I'm not sure what year that was in, was testament to George's commitment and dedication to improve the quality and the learning of our students. During the building of the library, we had I don't even remember, George Porter was a very handy minister, and he and George spent a lot of time with that. Volunteers, of course, did other things where they had special skills. But as mentioned before, that library was dedicated to him. George, when the principal at the time, I think it was Sean Johnson, and the board decided that we would dedicate the library to George. We couldn't dare let him know what was happening because he would have absolutely not rolled up. But there's a plaque there to this day dedicated to George and his commitment to the school, really, but the library is just a kind of his legacy. Later, there were other pastors that lived in the schoolhouse, as we call it, that always helped with any repairs and maintenance on the school, and I think especially Pastor Ken Curtis. And some of these people that helped George were kind of partners in crime. They would scheme and things themselves, always nut out a problem. And during George's time on, it was very convenient to have an electrician in the family, so anything electrical that was needed at school. Nigel was, what could you say, initiated into the job. Poor Nigel, I don't know whether he was always keen, but he could never get out of it. And over the years, I can speak for somebody else that we didn't honour a few weeks ago. Jim Pram was great at doing things, especially garden-wise at the school, and always helping. Whenever the working bees or anything needed, if he saw a need, Jim would come and help. We really appreciated that, Marion. More recently, he worked with Alan, but George, as he grew older, he sat and supervised. And if there was any problems, Alan and George would work out the best way to do something and overcome it. So George always got on with whoever built with him. They were cooperative. He wasn't necessarily the boss, but they worked things out together. On the board, when I think, I worked with George for this number of years, and George was, as we know, fairly determined to have things his way at times. But there are only twice that I remember that he virtually didn't get his own way. It came time to paint the school, and the school had probably been, it was probably 12 or more years since it had been painted, and it definitely needed it. And of course, Roger was involved with this a lot. Thank you, Roger and Dan, for being here. That was the colour of the paint that we had our dispute about. George thought the school had been for 50 odd years cream and green, and why couldn't it remain cream and green? And we only did this 3 or 4 years ago, so the school chose to have more modern colours. We had to re-roof at the same time, of course. Thanks again to the conference. As George's health deteriorated, he was unable to continue on the board, and he reluctantly relinquished his role as chair. His commitment did not go unrecognised. The proprietors of the Whangarei Adventist Christian School and the New Zealand Adventist Education Office wanted to extend their deep and sincere appreciation of George. So they presented him with a citation. He had already had his first stroke at this stage. So I'll read the citation to you because it's basically a summary of everything that we, the proprietors and the school, the board, thought of George. George has shown his commitment to the Adventist Christian education throughout his 27 years tenure as member of the Board of Trustees of the school, 22 years of which he served as board chair. As a dedicated board member, he gave freely of his time, skills and resources to nurture and sustain the presence of an Adventist Christian school in the Whangarei community. His passion for Christian education has had a profound influence on the entire school community, and his tireless efforts and wide experience have sustained and grown the school. George's contribution will be measured in more than bricks and mortar. Numerous changed lives and Christ-like characters will attest to his commitment to educate for eternity. It was both a privilege and a blessing to know George as a friend and as a work colleague on the board. I would like to pay tribute to the people that have come today. We have former principals here, former teachers. Thank you for coming, plus our current board members too. Thank you.
Thank you all. We'll now have open tributes, starting with members of the family. And then if you would like to share a few words, just invite you to make your way forward to some of the pews in the front. And then when the time comes, you're welcome to speak. Thank you.
Yeah, no, fine. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today on this occasion to celebrate the life of my dad, father, and friend. So on behalf of my siblings, most of you might know some of them. Julie, she's the oldest. Denise, second. Myself, Stephen, and young George, or George number 2, Chloe, whatever. We thank you for coming, and just want to say that this will be short and sweet, as it seems that none of us kids have inherited, we all have inherited the mislike of public speaking and having pictures taken. Dad was not a fan of this picture taking and talking in front of crowds either. So where do we start? Guess it's not easy to get a combined 220 years of ages into a couple of minutes. To make this short, we have chosen some highlights or a memory from growing up with George as our father. From Julie. Julie always remembers Dad being thrifty. From purchasing a box of apricots when on that famous South Island trip in the Morris 1100, and we carted it all the way back to the Hokianga in the footwell of the Morris. Why, you may ask? Because Dad liked apricots. And what Dad liked, he usually got. And why not purchase a box full when you had the chance when on a family holiday? Maybe that's the reason, to this day, that Nigel never touches apricots. Another story of travelling with an overloaded car Julie remembers was when the family of 6 plus 1 extra went on a road trip from Sydney to Brisbane. Imagine 7 people packed into a Holden station wagon. Seems not a lot of thought back then was put into passenger safety. The boys, being younger, were either lying on top of the luggage in the back of the wagon or sitting in the front seat with Mum. To bring the cost down further, I think the youngest member, maybe Nigel, of the family was sometimes confined to sleeping in the wardrobe in the room with Mum and Dad in the motel. So Denise's famous memory was the following. Do you want to read it?
I'll have a go at it.
Okay.
Okay. I'll be quick. This was when we were at Yvonne and Owen's wedding, so back in early 2007. Again, Dad being thrifty, got the nice accommodation, and we got up a few mornings later and we were going to go and get breakfast, but we all wanted the nice golden arches, but Dad wanted us to go to a takeaway and get something quick. So we're driving out of the driveway of the motel and Nigel's driving and we're meant to go right, but Dad's on the steering wheel, he's the passenger pulling it left because he didn't want to go. Anyway, we get there, we all ordered, Mum was more than happy to be there, and then Dad tried to order, well, the poor young girl couldn't understand what he wanted because Dad didn't want the egg muffin, he wanted just half the muffin with an egg and potato being his dish of choice. So I, getting a little bit frustrated, thought I'll take over and ordered it for Dad. Dad being Dad, got a bee in his bonnet and went and sat down, and I delivered his food and put it on the table and took the top of the bun off, put his hash brown there and just said, you eat it. This is how we were told as children, you eat what's in front of you or you go without. So he did eat what was in front of him on his own table, while the rest of the family had a few laughs about the naughty boy in the back corner. I'll give you back to Stephen now.
And Denise further went on to say that he might have been ahead of his time because now at McDonald's you can sort of choose what you want to eat. So Dad wanted to do that many years before that became popular. So my memory, or one of the memories, again, in all the years, was just after our first yacht, Giota, had been christened, and Dad, not having had a heap of sailing experience at that point, and neither had the rest of the family, we were all in the same boat as such. So one weekend, Dad suggested that we sail down the coast and I could take a friend. So a friend was asked. Notably, Shane Ringrose, who's actually up the back there today. Thank you, Shane. And off we went on one of the first trips out of the Whangarei Harbour. At the time, I would have been in mid to late teen years, and Shane was about the same age. All was going well until some dark clouds started heading our way. "It's okay," Dad said. "It's just some rain coming." All of a sudden, from happily sailing along at a leisurely place, the yacht was on its side, and we weren't really sure what to do. Well, as the saying goes, all hell was breaking loose. We had been knocked down by a weather squall. Dad started the engine to try and get the yacht upright again. I don't think he even let the sails go to try and correct the issue we had. Shane was on the upper side of the boat, and at the time, I think he was ready to jump ship. He later reported that when he looked over the edge of the boat, he saw the propeller spinning around. Not sure if we believed Shane at the time, but to this day, he stands by that story. After that, sails were reduced and the teens put life jackets on, as I think we were all a bit shaken up, and proceeded on our journey. Dad went on to sail many more miles at sea without too many more troubles. Yes, there were some, but that's for another day. Dad loved all things about boats, both big and small, motor and sailing boats. Okay, this is about Nigel. He can't remember this, but it was one of the thoughts that we all came up with about Nigel and Dad. So Nigel, being the youngest, was well and truly looked after growing up with two big sisters to mother him while Mum was out working on the farm with Dad. One story is that Nigel was still a toddler and had been put down for an afternoon nap. All was good until Dad came home on a bike. He'd been put down for an afternoon nap. All was good until Dad returned home on his motorbike from the back of the farm. Not only was Dad on the bike, but also Nigel, who was meant to be sleeping in his bed, was with him. Mum had no idea what had happened or why Nigel was with Dad on that motorbike. It turns out Nigel really was a daddy's boy and jumped back and had jumped out of his bedroom window, walked across a number of paddocks with electric fences, up the farm race to find where Dad was working that day. I know as a family we always mention how much alike George and Nigel are in looks. I don't think Nigel enjoys the attention that comes his way due to his good looks, but he handles it well most of the time. Just the other day, looking at pictures, I noticed a pattern with a few of them. I asked Denise what was in common with all of these pictures. The first thing she said was, his nose, and they all look like Nigel. That was not the answer I was looking for, but it did make us burst out laughing. Living on the farm, there was always chores or jobs to do to earn money for petrol for our motorbikes. I'm not sure if any of us earned to ride a pusher bike before we learned to ride a motorbike on the farm. From a mighty 50cc Honda bike to a 100cc Yamaha, all of us had our fair share of fun on the farm bikes, along with a few accidents. But we had to work to be able to ride, and work we did. From milking cows to helping in the wool shed in shearing season, all helped us earn petrol money instead of pocket money. Dad was always active in his younger years, but as we all do, he slowed down considerably as time went on. The last couple of years would not have been easy for him, as he was always doing stuff with his hands, and this now became a lot more difficult. We will remember Dad just for so many different things, and he will be missed by the family and the people he associated with. And I've just got a little bit on the end. Mum doesn't know I'm doing this, but it was just a thank you to a couple of people before I finished. First, to Lou and Lurleen Ringrose and Alan and Sheree Liggett. On behalf of us 4 children, we thank you all for your support and dedication, for visiting Mum and Dad over the last years, and especially during this last couple of years. Every time I was in Whangarei, you could be sure that either couple would pop in and visit Mum and Dad and have a good old chinwag about all different things. I know Mum especially always mentions you all when we chat and very much appreciates the support and help you have given her to her and George during recent times. Also, to Mum's next door neighbour Maggie, I'm not sure if she's here today, but to Maggie, so many times in talking to Mum, she says, Maggie's done this for us, and Maggie's brought food over, and Maggie's done that. Often when I visited, Mum and Maggie would meet at the fence and exchange stories of what's been going on with life, as Mum does. It's hard to keep Mum quiet sometimes, as a lot of you might know. Maggie has truly been a great neighbour and friend, and has always had an eye over the fence to make sure Mum and Dad were behaving themselves. Thank you for your support of both of our parents and keeping a watchful eye on them. Last but not least, Ma, remember we've got your back. Don't ever forget that. As with the recent trip to Australia, you were doing things at your age that I guess you never thought you could or would do. Stay strong and never be afraid to ask us for help. Even if it is to change a light bulb. I think we might know someone who can do that. We love you heaps. Thanks. Julie, Denise, Stephen and Nigel.
Afternoon, I'm Lou Ringrose, and I'd like to express my condolences to Greta and the family that are here and family that are online. We just really want to pass on our appreciations for what George has done in this church here in Whangarei, as a deacon, as a senior deacon, and an elder, and he was really part of our community here in this Whangarei church. And thank you, Greta, too, for what you have done over the years. It's been really, really appreciated. And as we've mentioned, George was a Mr. Fix-It. And if there was any problems, anything at all, George was here to change a light bulb or fix a door or put a screw in here or whatever, and we've really appreciated that over the years. On a personal basis, George and Greta, they've been really close friends, and we've had some really good times together, and particularly out on the water. And I remember the first time, it was fairly early days, I think it was probably the second trip that they did on the yacht in Giota, and George invited myself to, we could sail up to the Pai here, and I thought that wasn't a bad idea. And the girls, actually Lillian and Greta, actually I think they drove up to Pai here, and so we were on our own. And the weather was fairly good for a start, and it was probably a little bit like what Stephen mentioned when they headed south. We were going really good, and then George says, "Oh, you can take over." And I'd never sailed a yacht in my life. He says, "Oh yeah, you'll be right." And but then what happened? We must have had a wind change, and I'm not sure what you call it, but the boom went from one side to the other, and just about took me out. But that was all right. But yeah, so we survived that one. But yeah, George, you'll be right. We'll be right. And but yeah, we actually got into Pai here safely, so that was quite good. And a little bit earlier on. We went out to the Poor Knights together for a day fishing, and in those days you could actually fish right at the Poor Knights. You can't now because it's a reserve, a conservation reserve. But I was actually with in the Melvilles boat, and I'm not sure who was with George, but it was a beautiful day. We went out there, and there was a little bit of breeze coming from the west, so we tucked in around on the other side of the Knights, in the sheltered side, and that was good. I think your boys might have been there. in Dad's boat. And we tucked around there, and we had a bit of a fish and had a lunch, and then all of a sudden we looked out to the east and we thought, whoa, what's that white stuff? And we'd never seen it before, and it just sort of came out of nowhere. And it was white, and it was just right along the horizon. And we thought, oh, well, no, it must be time to go home after a while. And we put our nose around the corner, and whoa, the wind had come up, and it was just blowing a gale. And we said, oh, no, this looks too dangerous, and we might have to stay the night. But no, George said, no, we'll be right, we'll be okay, we're good. And his was a smaller boat than what we had, but we thought, oh, what are we going to do? So someone had a radio. I wasn't sure whether it was your dad or whether it was the boat that I was on. But we called and they tried to get what the forecast was, what it was going to be that night. And they said, oh, no, if anything, it's going to get worse. And so, it sounds like we're going to have to stay the night. But and then they suggested, well, there was a tour boat out there, quite a big one, and I still remember its name. It was the Pisces. And so what we did, we tucked in behind them, because it was about a 40-odd, 50-footer, probably quite a big boat. And so we both tucked in behind him until we got almost, probably 2/3 of the way across, until we could get a little bit of shelter from the land coming through. And so, yeah, but by that time we were getting very low on fuel, because normally you can get up and plane, but we weren't planing, and so both boats were just about out of fuel by the time we got close enough. So when we saw the sea was it was okay, we throttled off and got home. But yeah, that was an experience, and it was one thing that I always remember, and George's focus on what he wanted to do. He wanted, he was happy to go, and we respect him for what he was. So thank you very much.
Good morning, my name's Dan Carrasco, Education Director for the New Zealand Adventist Schools. While I'm standing here, I'm going to invite Roger Marshall to stand behind me, Rosalie McFarlane, if you can come forward too. I'm going to ask Lee and the former principal, Anna Charlie, any current teachers or past teachers that you're here, if you can just stand behind me. And I just want to express, come through Roger, come through Phil as well, Anna. Any current teachers or past teachers, if you can join me here, please. The reason why I'm inviting the people to come forward is because we are a living legacy of the past that we had worked with Roger, with George, apologies Roger, with George. But also too, the new teachers and new principals are the living legacy of what George has done for our school here in Whangarei. I'll probably give the people behind me just a moment to say anything. But on behalf of the New Zealand Pacific Union, Dr. Eddie Tupai sends his condolences to Greta. Pastor Eddie had done a lot of work here, but also had worked with Stephen as well. And also too, on behalf of the North New Zealand Conference Office, Pastor Bob Larson also sends his condolences, and both gentlemen acknowledge the great contribution that George has done for our school up here. But also too, the chairman of the proprietors of the New Zealand Schools Association also sends his condolences, and I'm sure that Roger will also be able to affirm that a lot of the things that George had done had advanced the gospel and the ministry of children here in Whangarei. So if anyone wishes to add to that space here, but it's been an honour to know George and also to have worked with George. God bless.
Hi everyone, I'm George's favourite. And whether it was our love of a good challenge or the DIY, or the fact that his little sister loved me and gave me the thumbs up to George, we had a great working relationship. I think I got everything I wanted. Things were hard sometimes, when Westpac pulled the checkbooks, he wasn't very happy, We probably wanted to write a letter to someone and complain about that, but yeah, one of my favourite memories was Christmas Day. I think it was our first Christmas in Whangarei, and we were at George and Greta's house, and we're not huddled around the table enjoying Christmas. We're huddled around the old desktop computer on Trade Me. So the auction for a van was closing on Christmas afternoon, and the school had grown immensely, and we needed that van to get the kids to tech. So there we were, huddled around Trade Me, and we won the van. And it was just such an answer to prayer and a blessing for everyone. And then George and I went on our road trip the next day, and in this crazy Boxing Day traffic. I think it took us about 6 or 7 hours to get to Auckland, if I'm right. It took all day, got the van and then brought it back. But yeah, we had lots of fun. There was no surprises in his eulogy. I've heard every one of those stories. Yeah, and he was a tough old guy. I think we both ate concrete for breakfast lots of days, but yeah, he'll be missed. And every single time he left the school, he would get the phone and he would ring Greta and say, I'm on my way home. So he was consistent. He loved his wife, Greta with 2 T's. And we just pray that you can hold on to the hope that we grieve with hope, because there's something more than this, and we all know that. So, yeah. See you in the morning, George.
I have a story which I think's funny. I hope you'll find funny. I think I first had my first relationship with Whangarei Adventist School 2012, where I was a teacher there, and I was also on the board of trustees as the secretary. And this one time, and I'd take the minutes. This one time, George and Ken were deciding on what type of vacuum cleaner to buy for the school. And I sat there, and I was just typing away, and then I just stopped. And after about half an hour of discussions on the said vacuum cleaner, George goes, have you written all that down, Lee? And I, yep. And he goes, yeah, well, I first it and someone seconded it. And I said, yep, I've written all that down as well. And so I all preempted it all because it was quite amusing. But sadly missed for the school. Oh, I'm the current principal there. And Greta and the family just send you our love and our thanks and appreciation as well.
So my name's Angela, and I've had the privilege of not only being the parent of kids who were schooled through WACS, but I also worked as a receptionist there for 5+ years. Greta and George were woven into the daily fabric of school life, as well as the calls to say coming home. I remember the calls from Greta to say, is he still there? George was always available, and I have memories of working with him on school projects such as numerous building ones, renovations, the swimming pool, and how we did the litmus test, him and I, every day to make sure it was swimmable. Renovations, technology, that was a huge project that George took on board. Board of Trustees involvement in the day-to-day running. George put his hand to anything and everything. And of course, one of the most important regular events, the morning tea in the staff room. My family with 2 children, having been schooled at WACS, are richer in their learning experiences, their relationship and their faith, in part because of the investment of time and of heart from Greta and from George. George was, when I spoke to him last, was still asking after our oldest, who has left and now doing university. And you guys were just amazing with the kids. George reminds me of the verse, Colossians 3:23. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. To me, George was supportive, knowledgeable, encouraging, and always ready for a humorous chuckle and ready to share our mutual love of our Lord. It is a privilege and a blessing to have had a connection with Greta and with George.
Every school needs a George Kershaw, and he's not with us anymore, and so it's a challenge who's going to replace George Kershaw. When you're doing school projects from Auckland and Whangarei, it's very important to have someone that you can count on. George was that person, he would pick me up from the airport, he'd drop me back at the airport, and he'd stick around while I was organising projects. Being a builder, of course, he always liked to add his tuppence worth. Now and again we had disagreements, but as you know, the person that has the money has the power. And so at times I had to make a decision which he didn't agree with, but many times we agreed. But when you think that he was involved with the school for 26 years, that is a real legacy. And we have a school in Whangarei today which we wouldn't have had if it hadn't been for him. And so he leaves a lasting legacy with you and for the school. And I'm sure through that many people will be blessed, the students will benefit from that, and may I encourage you all to continue to support the school. There's plenty of room there for students, and so if you know of people that have children that could go to that school, please say something to them, because no doubt about it, Christian education is something that a lot of people are desiring for their students today. And it's interesting, we've got more students in our schools today than we've ever had in the life of it, and it's because people are valuing the good moral values and the Christian education that's provided. So thank you for allowing George to serve our school for 26 years. Thank you.
Before I speak, is there any last one or two people who would like to share any words? This is the time. All right. Thank you for everyone who helped me to gain a bit more of a snapshot into George's life. I've only known him for just over a year. I'm sure, Greta, correct me if I'm wrong, but George came across as a very industrious man, resilient, tenacious, perhaps a bit stubborn, or am I wrong? No. Basically, George was a little Jack Russell. He was a dedicated follower of Jesus who served both Tikipanga and Whangarei at different times. But as you've come to hear, George also served our school faithfully, serving as a member of the board, chairman for many, many years. All around, a really solid human being. And I know George's health hasn't been the best over the past couple of years. It's been gradually waning. And this change had brought about quite a great deal of personal frustration, which I know was quite hard for him to work through, as well as for the rest of the family. Greta, Denise, Nigel, Julie, Wayne, Stephen, I know this has been tough to witness firsthand and also to work through alongside Dad. You may even feel like there was more that could be done at the end of the day. But you know what? You showed up, you cared, you loved, you served. And I think George knew that. And purpose as well as healing lies in knowing that. But I also want to encourage you today that God can repurpose this pain, sadness, and sense of loss that you're working through right now. I think if George could hear me right now, and probably if he heard everyone else speaking at the moment, I think he would have said long ago, "Oh, get on with it, would you? The funeral food is getting cold." If you want to hear more about that, perhaps ask Denise, she can share a bit more about that. And I guess fair point, but all I'm trying to say is you've lost a great husband, a brother, a great father, a grandfather, and a friend. So just don't let this moment pass you by. Because as much as God would like to get on with it, he actually takes personal interest in each and every single one of our individual sadness and pain. And to the degree that we can actually immerse ourselves into this fundamental truth about how God runs his universe, I guess we can truly begin viewing our pain and loss through the lens and prism of eternal hope. So with that said, I want to share with you just a short story from the Bible that I think captured the essence of George's hope. And that text is just found in Matthew chapter 8, verse 23 to 27. Matthew 8, 23 to 27, and it reads as follows. Then Jesus got into the boat. The text doesn't say, but I think the boat's name was Geota, which was the Toyota of the seas. And Jesus, started across the lake with his disciples from one side to the other. And suddenly, a fierce storm struck the lake, with waves breaking into the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him up, shouting, "Lord, save us! We're going to drown." And Jesus responded, "Why are you afraid? You have so little faith." And then he got up, rebuked the wind and the waves, and suddenly there was a great calm. The disciples were all amazed. "Who is this man?" they asked. "Even the wind and the waves obey him." Greta, you and George have done some amazing adventures over the years. I think from what I knew about George, he was a type of man to act first and think later. From the outset, you guys have always taken a leap of faith, being city slickers from Auckland, and you went and bought a farm up north in the middle of nowhere, long before the days of Google, cell phones, or YouTube. Greta, I don't think you know what any of those things are. Probably better that way. Greta's, as you know, is always up for a chat. Can you imagine her behind a keyboard typing at 80 words a second? Facebook might crash. Anyways, Greta, I guess what I'm trying to say is kids from my generation would call you guys crazy for taking such a leap of faith, and would have posted that all over social media about how crazy the Kershaws were. And yet, you know what? You and George made it work, didn't you? You got on with it. You started a family together, got involved in the community, and served wherever God placed you, or wherever you were placed, you served God. And then it was time for the next adventure, time to take another leap of faith into the unknown. So you bought a boat, cleaned it up, and sailed off into the sunset for a momentous journey filled with great memories and experiences, but most of all, stories. Taking leaps into the unknown seems to be a recurring theme for the Kershaw family. So today I share this text with you because as a family, I guess you once again find yourselves in uncertain waters, right? The story I just read of an event that took place with Jesus and his disciples while crossing the Sea of Galilee is truly incredulous, if not a little bit humorous. From a reader's perspective, of course. The whole crew in this narrative gets caught out by a pretty massive storm. And Lou, you shared of some pretty hair-raising adventures with you and George. And in this storm, in the middle of that storm, all the disciples are doing what needed to be done to keep the boat afloat while Jesus takes a nap. The disciples are gripped by fear, and Jesus is just chilling, taking it easy. This is incredulous because I struggle personally with my wife snoring at night, and here Jesus slept like a baby. But I also find it humorous because the first image that comes to mind, and this is obviously made up, of course, is Peter shouting instructions at Andrew from across the boat while being battered by wind and waves, with Andrew replying, "Shh, not so loud, or you'll wake Jesus." How is this man sleeping in the middle of the fiercest storm they've ever come across? The text doesn't go into detail, but I would love to ask Jesus how that event played out one day. Then the disciples wake Jesus. I guess they now genuinely felt it was time that he intervened. Jesus responds, perhaps if anything, a little bit annoyed at not being able to get a full night's sleep, by indicting them for their lack of faith. I mean, of all things, in a moment like that, Jesus, you calling us out for our lack of faith? Come on. I mean, there's faith, right? And then there's, hey, the boat is actually sinking and we're going to die unless someone gets things done. But what happens next shows us the true nature of God's power. Jesus was caught sleeping, but he wasn't caught napping. He gets up slowly. Apparently, the fact that the wind and the waves and the water are now breaking into the boat is of no great urgency to him. So in the middle of the fiercest storm they had ever come across in their entire life, Jesus spoke, and immediately everything became calm. Immediately, leaving everyone stumped. I can imagine the sudden silence that ensued to have been punctuated by one of the disciples chiming in what we all would have liked to have said at that moment. Well, that's great, Jesus. Could you have done that sooner? I don't have all the answers for you today. I think Jesus shows us consistently throughout his life that the moment we think we have God all figured out, he shows us otherwise. But today, I do want to leave with you just a small thought, and it's simply this. Jesus and God, by extension, was actually, quite literally, with the disciples in that storm, as fierce as it was. So, when we face uncertainty, know that God is not looking on from the outside or from the shoreline, radioing in, oh, there's a big storm on the way, you better make it to us. He's actually with us in the boat. He's not looking at us on the shoreline as some distant, disinterested, or disengaged deity. He's actually at the helm, riding those waves with us, even if it means he's just chilling while we're running around all freaking out. And I think this insight should help us with what we all struggle with in life: perspective. God shares all of life with us, our good times, as we got to share this morning, and also our not so good times. God is right there next to us every single step of the way. He shares in our joys, he shares in our happiness, but most importantly, he also shares in our pain and suffering. And so, yes, God is also saddened by the loss of George. He even faces uncertainty as one who comes alongside of us. So today we come and pay respect to George, a man who was never afraid to take a leap of faith into the unknown. And I'm pretty sure that was a bit irritating at times, Greta. Now, as a family, you find yourself in a similar space. Really encouraged to take a leap of faith into the unknown. And as you navigate these uncertain waters, know that God is not merely there waiting for you on the other side, nor is he merely waiting for George on the other side. He's actually also by your side every step of the way, as well as waiting for us on the new dawn. So, George, we'll see you in the morning. We'll remember you until then. Amen. At this time, I encourage us, as we wrap up, to all stand as we sing our closing hymn, Will Your Anchor Hold? Let's stand together. bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, we gather this morning, and it's really such a privilege to share and reflect on George's life and legacy, which touched so many people here today and many others who are tuning in online. So we pay respect to George's legacy for his humanity, for his care and service as a faithful steward of God. And Lord, we also gather today to remember your promises, to commit George to your eternal care, and we look forward to that day when we can be reunited with loved ones. So until then, Father, we commit George and ask that you would look after all of us as his family, friends, and all of us who have gathered together to support. May we carry on his legacy in every conversation that we have and the life we lead in the days that follow. So, Father, go with us today. We pay respect, and we look forward to that day where we can be reunited with George. Until then, see you in the morning. Amen. Thank you. You may be seated. I invite the family and pallbearers to come to the front. The rest of us just to remain seated while the family exits the church. Thereafter, you may make your way out. There is a memorial signing book in the church foyer, so please a reminder to fill that out when you can. Thank you.
Change